This is Sean Law from Sydney Lorcana, here to just talk about some testing that I've done for Ruby Amethyst during the reign of Jafar. Before I go in and talk about Ruby Amethyst, just thought I'd talk a bit about me and why I consider myself a good Ruby Amethyst expert. I mainly play Ruby Amethyst. I started playing near the end of Ursula's Return and started playing store championships from Shimmering Skies onwards. I did not play in the main event of the Melbourne DLC due to other commitments, but I have made top 8 in every store championship I've been to, except for 2 of them, and I've currently done 12. I've also won 2 store championships with Ruby Amethyst, and I made top 8 with Ruby Amethyst in the winner box in Good Game Central before the banning of Hiram Toymaker and Fortisphere. So with the reign of Jafar, there were a few cards I wanted to try out. In this first list that I did, I thought I'd try out the Palace Guard Spectral Sentry, Elsa Fierce Protector, and Hades Ruthless Tyrant. So I decided to go in this list for some of the evasive Peter Pan package. In my previous playtesting, I haven't been that impressed with Maui Half Shark and Ruby Amethyst, particularly in our Sydney meta, which is heavy Steel Song and green purple. I find that Half Shark shines a lot more in Ruby Sapphire since they have a plethora of actions, and I find in Ruby Amethyst, Half Shark is great if you've got a Peter Pan Shadow Finder in play, but if you don't have both of them in play at the same time, then the Half Shark is usually a bit slow, and at best it can get you back maybe one action before another evasive character comboed with Crab can take it out, or it can get killed by a Zeus. And with this list, I also, running 3 Hades, I decided to trim down on the Peter Pan Shadow and run a few 3 of so I could fit these new cards in, because I did find that running 4 Peter Pan Shadows can often clog my hand up if I draw multiples, and in Ruby Amethyst you generally want to be inking most turns, whereas in Emerald Amethyst you can sometimes skip a turn and keep the extra Peter Pan Shadows in hand for when they get answered. In Ruby Amethyst, it becomes a bit of a liability if you draw too many of them. And then I decided to put in the Queen's Castle just so that I would have some additional lore pressure. I tried the Flynn Sisu package as well to give some potential early game pressure, but I found that was still not that reliable, and often if I didn't draw exactly Sisu for turn 3, I might be able to squeeze out 1 proc from Flynn Rider, but a lot of decks are running Crabs and other 3-drops that have 3 strength. So I found that, the Flynn Sisu package was not that great in this particular deck list. The Queen's Castle, on the other hand, was very good, though it was still vulnerable to Merlin Fox, so you'd have to be a bit careful with when you played it. I also shaved down on a Be Prepared, since I didn't want as many high-cost uninkables, which is also why I cut the Ladies and the Lady Tremaines and the Madame Medusa, because at the moment this first iteration of the deck has 6-7 cost uninkables, and because I've got the Peter Pan in the deck, I opted to go for Genie and Iago instead of Merlin Goats and Merlin Rabbits, because I'm only running 3 Madam Mim Foxes and I replaced the snakes with Flynn Rider. I found with the deck that Hades can draw you a lot of cards. There were a couple of games where I ran out of cards or decked out. Whole New World was also a bit of a problem. So I decided to make some changes, and this was the second list that I tested. As you can see, I cut the Flynn Rider package and put in the Madam Mim snakes, put back in Merlin Goats and Merlin Rabbits, and then you put in the more traditional top-end Ruby Amethyst cards with the Tremaines, Madame Medusa, and then I went back to 4B Prepareds because I found that, I really needed 4B Prepareds because often it would either get wheeled out of hand or potentially grabbed by Ursula Deceiver if I drew it early. And I cut back from 3 Hades to 2 because swapped essentially a Hades for a Be Prepared, and I found the idea of putting the Elsa in was that if Hades is drawing me a lot of cards along with Rabbit, that Elsa's ability to tap 1, discard a card, and exert an opposing character would come up more frequently, because in an ideal setting with Ruby Amethyst, you want to play to the board early, do efficient trades while still maintaining board presence, and then really using Be Prepared as more of a get out of jail free card. However, I have found that as a lot of the aggro decks have gotten new tools in multiple sets, sometimes we're now having to lean a lot more heavily on Be Prepared and then try to answer whatever they're playing whilst putting libraries and castles in play to start giving you lore, and then also starting to sort of deploy more characters so you can quest faster. So I found that, where you tend to lose with Ruby Amethyst is if someone has a fast start and they're already at 20 lore before you've gotten a chance to play Be Prepared, or you've played Be Prepared and they're at 15, 16 lore, and then you have to answer everything that they're playing, and then you don't draw the Elsa, Fifth Spirit, or the Tremaines, or the Medusas, or you have to, be prepared when there's 2 characters in play because you're just trying to still stabilize. So that was why I put the Elsa Fierce Protector in. And then also in this list, I increased the count of library and decreased the Queen's Castle because I found that library is a little harder to deal with, and still is much easier to draw cards from library because you're forcing your opponent to interact with your characters, or potentially you can do a trade with your character to gain an additional card. And I still put the Queen's Castles just to give additional lore pressure, because most of the deck, other than the Tremaines and the Hades, are questing for 1. So I'll just talk about the key takeaways I found with the new cards. So starting first with Hades Ruthless Tyrant. Here's some pros was that it's quite strong on the play. Similar to Hiram Flavisham, it can often draw you multiple cards if left unanswered. And it synergizes and can lead to explosive card draw with Diablo Obedient Raven, and I've also seen online, mainly from the YouTuber Quantum, with Cusco also enabling you to draw 3 cards from its short on patience ability, since when you banish Diablo Obedient Raven and Cusco, they also replace themselves. The cons with Hades is that he's not as good on the draw. In the current Sydney meta, which is quite dominated by heavy Emerald Amethyst aggro tempo decks and Steel Song, and now with anticipation of Horizon Green Steel discard with Beyond the Horizon, Chona Dogs with the new support, and Amber Steel aggro with the new Lady 3-drop card, I found that he is a bit too slow. And the other problem I found with Hades is that traditionally Ruby Amethyst doesn't apply a lot of early game questing pressure, so often with Hades, even if you can play him on turn 7, if you've managed to control the board a bit, with him questing for 2 every turn, the clock is still a bit slow, and also the 2 damage a turn starts to add up, because most of your characters are only able to take 2 to 4 damage, and the Elsa can take 5, but then you're sort of potentially opening yourself up to a go-go Darting Dynamo massive lore gain play. So final thoughts with Hades is that he could potentially be stronger post-rotation, especially if Madame Medusa the boss is not reprinted, or if Ruby Amethyst gets new cards that can help apply early pressure. Now with Elsa Fierce Protector, the pros are that she can have immediate impact if played on turn 5, and whilst the cost of discard is high, if you're ensuring that you have a lot of cards in hand, it's not really that noticeable, and it can also help you stabilize in much later in the game, as her Ice Over ability can be used multiple times each turn, which helps deal with multiple readied characters if you have the additional cards to discard. Now, the cons with Elsa, her 3-4 stat line is pretty ordinary for a 4-drop, and if you don't have a lot of cards or any way to refuel your hand, the costs of her discarding a card can be quite high, and also because her Ice Over ability requires 1 ink per activation, in addition to the discard, it can be a bit ink intensive. So final thoughts with Elsa Fierce Protector. Of the cards printed for Ruby Amethyst and Reign of Jafar, I think she definitely has potential to see play, and she may potentially be stronger in Blurple, since they have ramp to play her earlier and have additional ink, and they also have a lot of ways to replenish their hand. And the last card I'll talk about is the Palace Guard Spectral Sentry. So the pros is that it has good stats. 1-4 for 1 is quite good, and whilst the Vanish is a weakness compared to the other Vanish cards, because it's a 1-drop, it sort of mitigates it a bit, because most of your 1-drops are generally dealt with by Steel songs such as Strength of Raging Fire and Let the Storm Rage On. And Palace Guard is amazing with Merlin, since it will often survive as it has 4 willpower. And it's also good with Hades, Ruthless Schemer, since it can take 4 damage, so you can play Hades, put 2 damage on it, quest with Hades, and then put another 2 damage on it, which none of your other 1-drops can do that. Now the cons, it doesn't replace itself, unlike the other Amethyst 1-drops, and unless you have Hades or Merlin Crab in hand, it can be a terrible top deck later on in the game. So final thoughts with the Palace Guard is that I can see it being run in smaller numbers than the other 1-drops, particularly if your local meta doesn't have a lot of steel or you're not anticipating a lot of steel, and it feels like it will see more play post-rotation, particularly when the 1-drops that replace themselves from the older sets, mainly Chernobog's Followers, Creatures of Evil, and Magic Broom, Illuminary Keeper, may rotate out. So I hope that gave you some insight into some of the cards that I think were well with Ruby Amethyst. There are still a few other cards I'd like to try out, though most of the cards I'm looking at are the monocolored ones, as a lot of the dual colored ones are uninkable, so I think they may potentially see play post rotation, but at the moment Ruby Amethyst has so many uninkables, so trying to fit them in is a bit tight at the moment. Thank you for listening to the video. If you found it useful, then if you could please like, comment, and subscribe, that would be much appreciated. Thank you.